Hi, and welcome to Human Resource Strategy and Change Management, Lecture 7.3, Subsystem Approaches. So in looking at getting the structure of an organisation right, this is something which should definitely not be underestimated. Effective structuring provides much stability for the firm to successfully implement its chosen strategies and essentially maintain a competitive advantage. So in looking at the different subsystems that exist within an organisation, there are a range of different methods and interventions that can be useful in carrying out organisation-wide change. So let's explore some of these now. Firstly, you have the technical subsystem, which relates to business process reengineering and total quality management. You have the psychosocial subsystem, which relates to cultural change and the competing values framework, which we'll get to a little bit later. And you then have the managerial subsystem, which relates to management by objectives and performance management. So let's look at technical subsystems, business process reengineering. So this approach emphasises processes as opposed to business functions and really moves away from vertical structures, so functional or divisional structures, in favour of horizontal or process ones. And this is a really neat diagram which explains that in a little bit more detail. So in terms of the technical subsystem, we also have total quality management. So this involves applying quality approaches as a way of linking the strategic direction of the organisation with the operational processes that actually deliver the goods and services. So as you can see here up on the screen, there's this plan, do, check and act cycle. So essentially it involves planning changes for improvement, implementing these on a small scale, analysing the effects of these changes, acting on what is learned, and repeating the cycle from the first step with new knowledge, and going through the cycle again. So we then have the psychosocial subsystem and the competing values framework. So the psychosocial subsystem interventions are implemented most frequently at group and individual levels rather than organisation-wide levels. So these levels look at the social relationships between group members and individuals, and also social and task relationships between job roles and outputs. So in looking at organisational culture, no psychosocial subsystem is more influential as it is essentially embedded so deeply in the organisation. So in looking at reviewing and implementing cultural change, we need to look at the competing values framework. So this is a process that uses perceptions of opposing values to analyse the perceived cultural style and the desired cultural style. So in this model, I'll get a little bit closer, we have four major quadrants. So essentially we're looking at the level of stability and control, and also the focus, so whether or not it is an internal focus which emphasises perhaps the well-being and development of people in the organisation versus the external focus, which is very much on the well-being and development of the organisation itself. So in terms of the flexibility and change, this essentially is self-explanatory. So we're looking at whether or not the organisation is flexible and more of an individual focus versus whether or not it is very much focused on being stable and having a lot of control. So each quadrant is represented by whether or not it has a high degree of stability and control or a high internal or external focus. So you can see in the top left that we have the clan. So obviously this places a great emphasis on flexibility and internal focus and stresses cohesion and morale and really uses that as a criteria for effectiveness. Moving on, we then have the adhocracy, which emphasises flexibility and an external focus and stresses readiness, growth and resource acquisition. We then have the market in the bottom right, and this very much emphasises control and an external focus. So it views planning, goal setting, productivity and efficiency as really effective methods. And finally, in the bottom left, you have the hierarchy. So obviously we're all familiar with what a hierarchy involves. So it emphasises control and an internal focus and stresses the role of perhaps information management and communication as a way of really getting the most out of the organisation. So let's now look at the managerial subsystem and management by objectives. So we have 4 steps for the management by objectives implementation. So the first one is to set goals. So this involves looking beyond the day-to-day problems of the business, asking questions about fundamental purpose, and looking at goals that can be qualitative or quantitative. So obviously having a bit of a mix. The task is to then develop action plans. So this involves a set of steps assisting individual and work groups to reach their desired goals, whether or not they're qualitative or quantitative, providing guidance and direction rather than just setting a group of orders, and overly specific plans may reduce flexibility. So definitely being mindful of that as a manager in an organisation. The third step is to then review progress. So whether or not that is informal but regular reviews, or maybe formal and periodic reviews of the progress. The fourth step is to appraise performance. So this may be officially integrated into performance appraisal systems, and it may also be used to shape goals for the following planning period, which is also really important. So we then have the managerial subsystem, which relates to performance management. So it's important to note that performance management should be considered as an organisation-wide intervention. It is also something that requires a strategic view and goes far beyond just managing the day-to-day performance of individual employees within the organisation. And this particular point is really important to note. Many challenges may also exist for change practitioners to implement change of this nature at an organisational level. And some of these challenges include integration, leverage, good design, and also standardisation. So finally, let's take a look at some of the reasons for resistance to this organisation-wide change. So in week 5, we reviewed this very much from an individual perspective. However, we also need to consider how this resistance manifests itself in groups. So firstly, we have institutionalism. So this is when organisations pursue stability and subsequently resist change because their members don't think to do otherwise. So inertia is therefore created by past success or power relationships, and it also relates to the tendency to perpetuate custom and practice. We then have uncertainty reduction, which essentially is the desire to maintain stable relationships with both markets and the workforce, and also subsystem misalignment. So these subsystems may relate to the structure of the subsystem, the various cultures within it, perhaps the strategy that is being pursued, or perhaps how these resources have been allocated.